He was a man of self-confidence, an independent thinker, a supporter of women's rights, and a supporter of young people.
He was a man of faith, a visionary, and simply, he was a man of action.
Simeon Brooks Chapin worked and socialized with powerful industrialists and financiers, men like William Wrigley and J.P. Morgan, but he was also close friends with spiritual leaders of his era, men like evangelist Billy Sunday and Dwight L. Moody. Simeon Brooks Chapin was a builder. He built schools, hospitals, churches, and community organizations. He also cared about people and built programs and institutions to make their lives and communities better. He was a titan on Wall Street, but enjoyed the simplicity of building stone bridges and fences and performing organ recitals for children in his home.
In the late 19th century, Milwaukee was a center of industrialization with a diverse population of immigrants. It was the commercial center of Wisconsin and a blue-collar cousin to nearby Chicago. It was the birthplace of Simeon Brooks Chapin. Born in 1865, Simeon Brooks Chapin was the fourth of 5 children of Emory David Chapin and Marietta Armour Chapin. His father, Emory, would become a prominent member of the Chicago Board of Trade. His mother, Marietta's family, founded Armour and Company, which included the Chicago Meatpacking Company, as well as other business interests.
Emory Chapin was S.B.Chapin, Sim Chapin's father, and grew up in Milwaukee. And he went out on the gold rush, as so many people did in the 40s and the 50s and of the 19th century, and there he met one of the Armour brothers. There were 5 Armour brothers, and they became sort of pals. They did not get any gold, but they talked about Chicago, which they both knew, and the Armour brother said, "When we get back, I want you to meet my sister." Well, he didn't say it once, but several times while they were out there, and I think, as you would imagine, Grandfather would have a dim view about this girl that he was trying to pawn off. Well, they did come back, and of course, they got married.
Perhaps the defining moment of young Simeon's life was the untimely death of his father at the age of 56. Prior to his death, Emory's business suffered major setbacks, forcing him to sell his assets to pay creditors. Unfortunately, at the time of his death, he still owed $40,000. At 18, Simeon worked as a messenger for his uncles at Armour Brothers Banking Company in Kansas City. After his father's death, Simeon decided to forego college and moved to Chicago to work with his uncles at Armour and Company. Business suited him, and quickly he discovered his professional calling, finance. In 1892, at 27 years old, he started his own brokerage firm in Chicago. But business wasn't his only preoccupation. He also discovered the love of his life, Elizabeth Bess Maddox.
He started his own business, S.B.Chapin and Company, in 1892 in the Rookery Building in Chicago. And that was the very year he married Bess Maddox. And people thought no good could come to anybody that was going that fast in life, starting a business and marrying too. But he did, and it was successful.
The late 1890s were a period of growth for the Chapins, both professionally and personally. A business partnership was formed to create Chapin and Gaylord, a brokerage firm in Chicago. The family also grew with the birth of Marietta and Elizabeth, Sim and Bess's first 2 children. They also built what would become their permanent summer residence in the hills around Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, many of Chicago's wealthy industrialists began building summer homes around Lake Geneva, which was located only a couple of hours away from Chicago. Simeon and Bess also fell in love with this area. Harry Hartshorn, Simeon and Bess's grandson, remembers when his grandfather first brought Bess to the shores of Lake Geneva and how they came to build Flowerside Farm, which still stands today.
And grandfather brought grandmother up in the 90s because he thought he would like to build a home here. And he brought her to see if she would like it, and they rented a farmhouse and also a little house in town. And then she liked Lake Geneva, and then he decided he would build. And when I got here after the war, Maud Best was still at the real estate office in town. And she said that her father, Lloyd Best, in 1895 or 6, had had a visit from a Mr. Chapin who said he'd like to walk the North Shore with the idea of finding something where he might build. Well, they started walking, and they walked, and some beautiful property was between here and town. And they finally got to which is Flowerside now, which was a marsh. In front of the pump house was just wetlands, what you would call it today. And he stopped and he said, "This is what I'm looking for." Well, I think Mr. Best had a dim view of my grandfather's ability to find land, but he did buy it, and in his mind, he was going to channel all that marshland out the lake into a stream, a brook, which he did. You can see the stones today. Anyway, that's where he chose to build, and that part of it was a little higher where he put his house. And someone said to him in those early years, I'm told, "Mr. Chapin, why did you build so close to the lake?" And he said, "I did not come to Lake Geneva to build in the woods. I wanted to hear the water from my window at night."
Making a home at Lake Geneva was just the beginning. Mr. Chapin amassed more than 1,000 acres of land for grazing brown Swiss cattle and raising hogs. Growing fruits and vegetables, he was a man of action, involved in every aspect of building Flowerside Farm. Even the bridges and fences were built with his own hands. No detail was too small. He and his family would spend almost every summer here until his death.
Mr. Chapin was a man of high ideals and principles. After his mother died in 1897, Simeon took action to reconcile his father's debts. Even though many years had passed since his father's death, and the debts had already been forgiven, Simeon located each of his father's debtors and paid them back in full. Also about this time, he became involved in the newly formed George Williams College and the YMCA movement. This association would last the rest of his life, and that would shape his philosophy and philanthropy. George Williams College began in 1885 as a camp for leaders servicing the YMCA movement, which was founded in 1844 by British merchant George Williams. The early YMCA movement was popular for its inclusiveness and progressive approach to Christian education and service. In 1896, the YMCA Chicago Training School merged with the Lake Geneva Institution, and the school evolved into a year-round training institute.
And that was the time that Mr. Chapin then was on the board, really from almost the founding of that campus in the early 1900s, and he was on the board through 1945. And I think he must have been interested in the mission, which was serving others in the helping professions. And so the big areas of training here and professional development were in social work, recreation administration, education, later nursing.
Simeon believed in the work of the YMCA, which in the early days included not only the development of mind, body, and spirit, but also the individual's responsibility to shape society around him.
I think that must have been why he felt so strongly about the college, and certainly this campus had a special place in his heart because of the beauty and some of the work that they were doing. But I think also he must have been interested in the academic campus, colleges and curriculum that were there in making that more professional and being able to work with more people who would then go out in the world and do the work of George Williams and helping societies.
I think he felt that young people needed a lift in the direction that they should have, as the YMCA would be a perfect example. But in everything he did, he was concerned with young people.
He served on the Board of Trustees at George Williams College from 1901 to 1945, and an annual award is made in his name to a trustee who best exemplifies Mr. Chapin's dedication to service.
Because of that long-standing tradition and honoring the outdoors that we've always had, we thought it might be a nice way to connect with the Chapin May Foundation, since that was always important probably to them and certainly to the college here. Just thought it'd be a nice way to honor them. A lot of people from the area come for concerts and that, and certainly would see the Chapin name and be reminded of his generosity and philanthropy to the area.
"1901 was another landmark year in the life of this man of action. Robert Gaylord left their partnership, and S.B.Chapin and Company was formed with offices in both Chicago and New York City.
He'd started S.B.Chapin Company in 1892 at the Rookery, and realized that New York City was the center for the brokerage business, and thought he should have an office there. So he moved the main office, he kept the one in Chicago, and he bought his house in New York.
Central Park on Fifth Avenue was where the Chapins lived and entertained. The house became somewhat of a landmark and was actually featured on the cover of the New Yorker magazine in 1934.
Well, it was my freshman year at Wellesley, and I went down to New York, and while I was there, Mrs. Chapin called and asked if I would come over for dinner. Being a freshman and from a small town, I looked forward with great anticipation, and particularly their home was on Fifth Avenue. And when I got there, Mr. and Mrs. Chapin were always so gracious in receiving me, and Mrs. Chapin had this beautiful white gardenia for me, which is one of the, I don't remember what we had to eat, but I do remember the white gardenia.
The S.B.Chapin and Company offices in New York and Chicago were immensely successful. By 1910, the business was reportedly one of the largest stock, grain, and cotton houses in the two cities. As the business grew, so did the family. Over the next 10 years, 2 more children were born: Simeon Jr. and Virginia. Meanwhile, back in Lake Geneva, Simeon and Bess enlarged Flowerside Farm to include 2 extra wings on either side of the main house. One wing was dedicated to accommodate Simeon's passion for organ music. An accomplished musician himself, Simeon had a grand Aeolian pipe organ installed that filled the entire breadth of the East Wing. The Chapins' love of Lake Geneva and their philanthropic philosophy of life benefited the local community. Land was donated for the construction of the Horticultural Hall in downtown Lake Geneva, which is still in use today for craft shows and the farmers market. He also assembled the land for the expansion of the Northwest Military Academy. He donated a 40-acre tract of land to the George Williams Golf Club and later gave another gift of land for its expansion. He and Bess were also active in the leadership of several of the area's humanitarian organizations. Because of his love of the lake, Simeon also bought a small steamer yacht for cruising Lake Geneva. Christened the Marietta after his mother and his eldest child, Simeon took to the lake, visiting lakeside friends and neighbors. He also captained the Marietta to ferry children from the various camps located around the lake to his house for organ concerts and recitals. But the YMCA held a special place in Simeon's heart. Betty Hartnett's father, Robert McNally, was a leader with the YMCA and remembers Mr. Chapin well.
My father was the YMCA secretary in Lake Geneva, and Mr. Chapin was very much interested in Y work. Mr. Chapin was a summer resident, and when he was in Lake Geneva, he often came in to talk to my father. And that was the beginning of their relationship and their friendship, which lasted until his death. Mr. Chapin helped raise money for the Y because the Y existed on a lot of grants and donations. Mr. Chapin, my dad, would go around the lakeshore, talk to all the people who lived on the lakeshore to raise money, and having Mr. Chapin go with my father kind of put a little pressure on the people around the lake. But Mr. Chapin was always interested in just so many of the details of the life of the Y, about the physical details. He was also interested in scholarships for young people. Whenever the Y needed help, he was there. Probably one reason the Y got through the Depression was through the help of Mr. Chapin.
Another project that was dear to his heart was the Lake Geneva Water Safety Patrol, one of the first of its kind in the nation. It was started in 1920 with one lifeguard and one rowboat.
In 1920, Mr. Chapin thought it would be nice to have a water safety organization on the lake. And he went to the Red Cross, and between them they organized the Lake Geneva Water Safety.
The Water Safety Patrol, it was founded in 1920 by Simeon B. Chapin, and basically the Geneva Lake had become a very popular getaway spot, especially for people from the Chicago area. And as it became more popular, Simeon Chapin recognized the need for some type of safety program on the lake. And in 1920, they started out with swimming instructors and lifeguards. And the lifeguards kind of patrolled some of the area beaches. They were trained by the Red Cross. In fact, the whole organization was and is affiliated with the American Red Cross. They also hired some swimming instructors because Chapin and the rest of his group felt very strongly that if you would teach people how to swim, you would avoid many accidents and drownings in the future. So they thought, in fact, they wanted to do it for free, so they did. They offered free swimming lessons with the thought being, let's teach as many people as possible to swim, and that way we'll have fewer drownings in the future. So that's the way it all started out in 1920. And about 5 years later, in 1925, they got the first Water Safety Patrol boat. And that was used to go beyond the beaches and out into the water where people were enjoying boating. It was becoming a much more popular pastime.
When the Water Safety Patrol first started, it consisted of one lifeguard and a rowboat. And of course it has grown to many patrol boats now, many young people who are trained for life-saving.
Our basic mission is really the same as what it was when Simeon Chapin founded the organization. That mission is to keep Geneva Lake safe and enjoyable for all. So we continue to do the swimming lessons that they started out with in 1920. We continue to have lifeguard services. We have lifeguard services at 12 different locations around the lake right now. And then our boat patrol has grown considerably. We now have a fleet of 6 fully equipped rescue boats that are on the water all summer long patrolling the lake. Not just responding to calls when we get them, but also out patrolling, looking for calls or looking for boaters who may be in distress or who may need help of some type. So it has grown in terms of size. We have about 85 employees in the summer now that work for us. And that's grown considerably from the 1920s, of course.
In 1910, Simeon's older sister, Alice, asked that the family visit her in Pinehurst, North Carolina, where she had a winter home. Loving the mild winter and the premier golf course, Simeon also took up seasonal residence there, building the family a winter home.
His sister, Alice Chapin May, said to him, "Sim, you really ought to come down to Pinehurst." He'd never heard of it, I don't think. And she'd gone down with her husband, Mr. May. "You would like it, Sim." Well, not only did he like it when he got there, but he built a house which was a twin to the one she rented, but he'd bought some land, and then he bought the house next door. Mr. Chapin always liked 2 houses. He liked to go to bed early, and he wanted his guests to enjoy themselves, but in the other house. So having discovered Pinehurst through his sister, Mrs. May, he found himself going there every winter.
Then, in 1911, while vacationing in Pinehurst, Simeon learned of a new business opportunity. A large tract of newly developed land along the South Carolina coast was offered up for sale by a family business called the Burroughs and Collins Company. Simeon visited the fledgling resort of Myrtle Beach and liked what he saw.
There were 64,000 acres that were for sale in South Carolina, and he sent a surveyor down, and the surveyor came back to him and said, "There's a wonderful pine forest for lumber. There's also turpentine, grows excellent corn, cotton," and he named everything that the land could produce. 64,000 acres this Scottish family had accumulated. And in addition, Mr. Chapin, there are 9 miles of beachfront. Worthless.
Chapin wanted to buy the property, but his business associates did not. He traveled all the way from Chicago by train to break the disappointing news in person to the Burroughs family.
Oh, he came down and he explained, "I've come down to tell you that I can't swing it." And I think they probably were impressed with somebody that would come all that way when you had the telephone and you had the telegraph. But I tell you this because it's typical of Mr. Chapin that he always went to see the person he had business with. And it developed as someone at the table said, "Well, on the other hand, we could go into partnership." And I guess he liked that, and because who would be managing the property but the people that owned it? They'd be 50-50 partners. So that's how he got into Myrtle Beach in 1911 and 1912.
Together, they began the development of Myrtle Beach, which has become one of the nation's most popular seaside resorts on the East Coast. In 1935, Simeon also built an oceanfront home there, a modernistic design unlike any of his other homes. He called it Yaupon Dunes, and it still stands today.
Simeon Chapin took his religion seriously, but he was tolerant of religious opinions of others, even though he was convinced of the soundness of his own. He was a friend to evangelist Billy Sunday, and he was also inspired by his daughter Elizabeth's love and commitment to Indian spiritual leader Maya Baba, and for her quest to found a spiritual retreat. Mr. Chapin made a gift of his own property in Myrtle Beach. Today, this unspoiled oceanfront land is known as the Mayor's Spiritual Center and welcomes guests from all parts of the world. He supplied land, hymnals, and Sunday school supplies for churches around the country. He was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York City, but supported religious education in many denominations. Even on the last day of his life, he was making sure that the hospital in North Carolina that he helped found had enough Bibles for all the patient rooms.
Well, these are my father's words from address he made at Mr. Chapin's memorial at College Park in 1945. And he said, Mr. Chapin was a Christian gentleman of the first magnitude, a loyal adherent of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York. He could be a Congregationalist or a Baptist in Lake Geneva, a Methodist or Presbyterian in Myrtle Beach, or an Episcopalian in Pinehurst, equally at home with them all, and supporting most community churches with impartiality.
His desire to serve others has lived on. In the early 40s, Simeon sold his brokerage business and retired. He then created 4 foundations, one in each of the communities in which he lived: Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Sanborn, North Carolina, and Chicago, Illinois. His desire was to fund educational, religious, and other charitable organizations in these communities. The North Carolina Foundation is the smallest, with annual grants averaging $4,000. The Chapin May Foundation of Illinois, formed with his sister Alice Chapin May, assists similar organizations that the siblings had long been involved with, such as the Pacific Garden Mission of Chicago. The Lake Geneva Foundation has given more than $1 million to religious and educational causes. The Myrtle Beach Foundation serves groups within the city limits and over the years has contributed more than $15 million to Myrtle Beach churches, libraries, hospitals, the YMCA, and other civic projects.
And always with the same purpose in mind, to help young people, hospitals, churches, and libraries. And libraries because of Mrs. Chapin, to include her. She was a great reader and enjoyed books, so he put in libraries.
Well, I think that my dad put it very well, the things that were so wonderful about Mr. Chapin. And he said he was humble in spirit, he was approachable to a marked degree, he did not weary in well-doings. Once having convinced himself that a cause was worth his attention, he remained loyal to it through thick and thin. And he was a builder. Nothing challenged his constructive genius more than the building of highways, the development of communities. He talked about his graciousness and his ability to see the kernel of truth in things around him.
And I think he was a great man. I think he was very unselfish and very compassionate and very honest.
But with Chapin, it seemed like when he had a good idea such as this, such as forming the Water Safety Patrol, he really followed through on it and made sure that it was going to work and it was going to accomplish its goals, and it continues to do that now. Here we are 85 plus years later, still living out the dreams of Simeon Chapin.
Simeon Brooks Chapin summed up his philosophy of life in these statements as read by his grandson, Harry Hartshorn.
I love to see things grow. I would have no right to the things I have if I did not share them with others. The important thing is that young people shall understand what is worthwhile in life.
Simeon Brooks Chapin would be proud to see that his philosophy continues. Through his foundations, he continues to grow the communities he loved. He continues to inspire young people to grow in mind, body, and soul. And he continues to encourage faith in God for all.
Simeon Brooks Chapin, a man of action whose benevolence continues to have a resounding impact both now and into the future.